At the request of the Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane safe or flight mode depending on their device. It's not sufficient to just put your phones on silent mode, as this will maintain a level of interference in the broadcasting system. Item number 6 today on the agenda is housing for people with a disability, and I would like to welcome to today's meeting Mr Tony Cunningham from the Irish Wheelchair Association, Ms Siobhan Barron, Dr Gerald Craddock and Mr Edward Crean from the National Disability Authority. Before we begin, just a note on privilege. I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 172I of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to so do, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I would now like to call on Mr Tony Cunningham to make his opening statement, please.
Thank you, Chairperson. As a representative body for people with physical disabilities, Irish Wheelchair Association would like, I suppose, to thank the committee for the invitation today and for the opportunity to contribute to your work regarding housing for people with disabilities. IWA has a vision, and it's of an Ireland, I suppose, where people with disabilities have equal rights, have equal choices and opportunities in how they live their lives, and where our country is a model worldwide for a truly inclusive society. And since our foundation in 1960, will be 60 years coming shortly, we were founded by 10 people who are wheelchair users themselves. And one of the single biggest issues facing people with physical disabilities has been access to the built environment, including public buildings like Leinster House, hotels, retail outlets and footpaths, to name but a few obvious ones. Over the decades, thankfully, considerable progress has been made in revised building regulations, the design of new buildings, retrofitting of old buildings, again like Leinster House, much improvement there, and upgrading of roads and footpaths. Thanks to all of this, it has supported people with physical disabilities to have more access to the community, to participate more and to contribute to society and the economy. However, one of the remaining issues continues to be the lack of suitable housing, affordable housing for people with physical disabilities, and in particular people who use wheelchairs. And we're talking about social housing, but also private housing and private rental housing. Despite the many achievements of the housing strategy for people with disability, IWA members who are wheelchair users, and that's important, and who are registered and approved for social housing, have not been receiving offers of housing. Many people have been on the local authority housing lists for years and years with no offer in sight, and some of my colleagues are here with me today. The contribution and recommendations made by IWA to the Oireachtas Committee today are based on our long-standing 60 years of working with and on behalf of people with physical disabilities, on our experience as an approved housing body, as a member of the Irish Council for Social Housing, on IWA's membership of local housing and disability steering groups in the various local authorities, and membership of the advisory group and monitoring committee to the National Housing Strategy, but mainly from our experiences of our members who are full-time wheelchair users. Now, in terms of, I suppose, understanding housing need for people who are full-time wheelchair users, we're talking about housing that's designed differently to standard housing, not extras or adaptations, but designed differently to the standard housing. Standard housing, as we know it, is not built to this type of design. It's built to comply with Part M of the building regulations, which requires housing to be visitable. And wouldn't we all love to be able to visit a house, but we'd also like to live in it. Part M 2010, when they talk about visitable housing, it says people can safely and conveniently approach and gain access. People can have access to the main habitable rooms at entry level, and a WC is provided at entry level. The strategic design and delivery of fully wheelchair accessible social housing is our focus today as an organisation in making our recommendations to the committee. Our recommendations are intended to support the strategic planning, design and delivery of wheelchair accessible social housing to meet what is an identified housing need for people with disabilities who require wheelchair accessible housing. And our recommendations are as follows. One is that the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government ensures that local authority housing application form currently being revised, I add, has a specific question to record wheelchair accessible housing requirement. So currently it's quite complex to extract the information from the form around wheelchair accessibility. You have to look at 3 questions on the form, and you have to cross-reference those with a GP or an occupational therapist report to get the relevant information. So our recommendation is that in the new form, a simple question, do you require wheelchair accessible house? Number 2 will be that a natural follow-on from that the local authority housing IT system, when it's reviewed, would reflect the details of the form and would have the capacity to generate the relevant reports that would support the strategic planning and reporting on delivery of housing. Number 3 is that every local authority would review its current approved social housing list to identify the number of people who require wheelchair accessible housing. That is not, as we understand it, readily available in all local authorities. Number 4 will be that the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government agree a wheelchair accessible housing design specification with IWA and other stakeholders. Number 5, that the local authorities will strategically plan to ensure that 7% of every social housing development funded by the Exchequer is designed to be wheelchair accessible, thus promoting sustainable communities. And finally, building regulations, Part M 2010, that they will be reviewed to include wheelchair accessible housing design like they do in the UK. So I look forward to discussing these in more detail. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. I'd now like to call on Ms. Siobhan Barron to make her opening statement, please.
I'd like to thank the Chair and the members of the Joint Committee on Housing, Planning and Local Government on behalf of the National Disability Authority for the opportunity to present on housing for persons with disabilities. The NDA is an independent statutory body, and while we're not a representative body, we were established to provide independent and evidence-informed advice to the Minister for Justice and Equality on matters of policy and practice relevant to the lives of persons with disabilities. We also have functions to promote the adoption of universal design to the built environment, products, services and ICT, so that they can be easily accessed, understood and used independently to the greatest extent possible by all persons, regardless of their age, size, ability or disability. It therefore broadens our remit beyond disability. The NDA engages with many stakeholders, including in particular the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government and the housing agencies on issues relevant to persons with disabilities. Based on the returns from Census 2016, we know there are over 643,000 persons with disabilities in Ireland. Most persons with a disability will have acquired their disability, particularly in adult life, and we were talking about all kinds of disability, from physical, sensory, intellectual disability, mental health, autism and sensory impairments. Persons with disabilities are more likely to rely on local authority housing than other citizens, 12.8% compared to 8.3% of the general population. This arises particularly where persons with disabilities have poorer employment prospects than others, and also due to higher costs they may have related to their disability. They may also be more dependent on the state for support in securing a permanent home. This generates a demand for more social housing options. The right to adequate housing has its origins in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the international conventions that followed. In particular, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which was ratified by the government last year, further elaborates on the meaning of the right to adequate housing as it relates to persons with disability. The Convention creates a new benchmark for the realisation of the right of persons with disability to adequate housing through Article 19, which refers to living independently and being included in the community. It requires Ireland delivers on the rights of persons with disabilities to live in the community with choices equal to others and to have the opportunity to choose their place of residence and where and with whom they live. This is the heart of the policy of decongregation being progressed by the HSE, but is also relevant to persons with disabilities who live in the community who may wish to move out of the family home, for example. Article 28 of the Convention requires the State to deliver on the right to adequate housing and to ensure access by persons with disabilities to public housing programmes. The Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government has made a number of commitments regarding persons with disabilities under various strategies on housing, including the Social Housing Strategy 2020, Rebuilding Ireland, and in the National Disability Inclusion Strategy 2017 to 2021. The Department's National Housing Strategy for People with Disabilities for 2011 to 2016 has been incorporated into Rebuilding Ireland and extended to 2020 for delivery. The NDA was on the Department's advisory group on the development of that strategy and were part of related subgroups and the Department's implementation monitoring group for the strategy. The Department affirms a commitment to implementing that housing strategy in the National Disability Inclusion Strategy. The National Disability Inclusion Strategy is currently undergoing a mid-term review, and the NDA suggests that there is an opportunity to strengthen actions therein on housing for persons with disabilities. To date, we know there have been a number of actions progressed under the National Housing Strategy, which include, for example, designing housing to meet the needs of all toolkit and website as a resource for housing authorities, developers and housing providers, to develop and design housing projects to be inclusive, adaptive and accessible. There were also actions progressed in relation to promoting the take-up of the Capital Assistance Scheme for persons with disabilities and to streamline the application and decision process. There was a production of the summary of social housing assessments on households qualified for social housing support who have yet to have their needs met. There's production of a guide by the Housing Agency on housing assessment and allocation process for persons with disabilities to assist local authority staff in applications and managing waiting lists. And there has been some streamlining of the Housing Adaptation Grant Scheme, with rising numbers of grants paid each year. Making housing-related application processes more accessible has also been advancing. And then there are the Housing and Disability Steering Committees in each local authority. While they are just a few examples, and even within those we know that further work will be needed to achieve greater impact on housing access to housing for persons with disabilities. The NDA has also been advising on the various initiatives, those various initiatives, and also others that will continue to be advanced within our independent role. At the same time, we note that there are more goals that have yet to be realised within that strategy, given that it is to be completed next year. While the decongregation of persons with disabilities from institutional living arrangements to community living continues, it has been acknowledged that the original timeframe of 2019 for decongregation will not be met, so that the timeframe will need to be extended. Some of the delays are in part due to access to housing, to the need to tender and re-tender for refurbishments, and to planning permission issues. We continue to advise on such matters, including conducting an evaluation project for learning from decongregation. Changes in the structure and delivery of housing benefits cannot alone make it easier for persons with disabilities to secure accommodation. There are difficulties accessing private rental accommodation, not only because of the lack of accessible properties, but also because many persons with disabilities are priced out of the rental market. The Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission's recently published annual report stated that it's apparent there is systemic discrimination against people in general in terms of housing and social welfare payments, and that persons with disabilities are more than twice as likely to report discrimination relating to housing, and over 1.6 times more likely to live in poor conditions. Scarce resources are understandably being directed towards dealing with those in emergency accommodation and experiencing homelessness, but the issue of homelessness for persons with disabilities and mental health difficulties needs particular attention, and the NDA will shortly be funding research on this. There have been difficulties with a lack of uniformity across the country in relation to combining an offer of housing with the availability of appropriate care packages. We recognise the housing crisis means not enough houses are being built to meet needs, but it is important in addressing this that the right type of housing is being built to meet the needs of persons with disabilities, and indeed the changing needs of householders who may acquire a disability over time. We advise that Part M of the building regulations needs to be reviewed and updated, particularly with due regard to NDA's Universal Design Home Guidelines, so that the accessibility standard for new buildings would be higher. While there is a summary of social housing needs assessment, further work is needed to ensure robust data to plan housing to meet housing needs. In particular, active consideration on the potential for better collection of data in relation to accessible housing and the range of housing available would also be helpful. The type of housing we build now, how it is designed and where it is located all impact on the individual. The long-term benefits from housing following a universal design approach could realise savings to the state in health and social care, could help alleviate the challenges presented by climate change and could help improve the well-being and fabric of communities. The NDA has been engaging with many stakeholders, including local authorities in the Department, on the adoption of a universal design approach to housing. We welcome the recent commitment by that Department and the Department of Health in the recent housing options for our ageing population policy statement. In particular, the reference to ensuring that 30% of all new dwellings would be built to incorporate universal design principles to accommodate our ageing population. We also welcome the report of this committee last year, in which it recommended looking at universal design and a cost-benefit analysis. And just to add at this stage that is included in the National Disability Authority's work plan. We'll be commencing a scoping exercise on that shortly. This focus on universal design and older housing sets an important precedent, but it should also prove to be important for persons with disabilities. The NDA will continue to engage with professional bodies such as the RAII and third-level institutions like the Technological University of Dublin in order to embed a universal design approach in the relevant academic and professional courses, in order to provide the skilled practitioners that will be required to plan, design and construct universal design homes. We are also working with bodies on continued professional development in this regard. The NDA is also aware of the particular needs of persons with mental health difficulties and the needs of those with autism. We have previously published guidelines to social housing and people with mental health difficulties, as well as guidance for local authority officers in relation to assisting persons with autism. The NDA has also been briefing the Housing Agency about the importance of preparing officials working in local authorities on their potential roles under the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act 2015. When the Act is operational, it will be up to local authority housing officers to be as supportive as they can be to applicants who may have capacity issues in making decisions on housing. The Housing Agency has been proactive in engaging with us about the development of its own guidelines in this regard. Like other countries, our population is living longer and the number of older persons is growing. It is expected that the number of persons with disabilities will increase by approximately 20% by 2026. This has particular implications for housing and supported living in the community and the need to ensure a sustainable housing model in Ireland. There is therefore an obligation on all stakeholders involved in planning, design and construction to take action to achieve this. There are various strategies and policies in place that, when fully implemented, can help progress access to housing for persons with disabilities in Ireland, particularly as part of mainstream housing developments. As well as the greater need for social housing, we advise that there should be greater emphasis on creating livable and sustainable neighbourhoods where persons with disabilities can live full and active lives as part of a real community. Thank you.
Siobhan. Victor.
Thank you, Chairman. Firstly, I want to thank the representatives from the Irish Wheelchair Association and the representative from the National Disability Authority and everyone else is present. And I'd particularly like to also welcome Senator John Dolan, who has an amazing track record in advocacy for this disability sector, and I think that is acknowledged by everyone in both houses of the Oireachtas, so I think that's important. And I suppose I want to thank you for the quality of your submissions. There were other submissions, we've read them, thanks for taking us through them again, but we've already had them and circulated them and read them. And I suppose what's coming out of all of this really is this allowing people to have the independent, the capacity to have independent living with dignity and respect in the community. And it is more than just a house. Living is more than just a roof over your head. Living is about being able to access your community facilities. It's about meaningful engagement in your community. and having equal access to that engagement, be it to partake in your own community, your own employment, or whatever you have. So that's what came over very strongly, and I want to thank you for that, because a lot of our emphasis in this committee can be about housing and bricks and mortar, but you went further, and rightly so, and I want to acknowledge that. And I suppose also to say, this is the first of 2 meetings on the subject in relation to housing for people with disabilities. The second is scheduled for next week, the 10th. And also there'll be other representatives from local government and Dublin City Council. So I think that's important. So it's part of a process. So what you're sharing with us today is feeding into a bigger picture in terms of policy, and I think that's to be welcomed. I suppose what struck me more than anything in all of the documentation I read in relation to today is that this recent research carried out by the Economic, Social and Research Institute, the ESRI, and the Irish Human Rights Equality Commission has found that people with disabilities were twice as likely to be people without disabilities to experience discrimination in accessing housing. That's profound, and that's disturbing, and we need to do something about it. So I just want to make that point because it came out in your literature, and it was something that I wasn't fully aware of. I had anecdotal evidence about it. I spoke to a woman the other day who's in one of the Dublin authorities, who's nearly 12 years waiting, and every time she goes to her authority, they tell her that she can have accommodation perhaps 8-9 miles away from where her supports are, and the people that care about her and love her and are there for her. And when she makes a case, she's told that she's been particularly choosy and difficult. That's very frustrating. She also needs to be on the ground floor. She also needs to access into the community on the street, because that's where she goes out to read her paper, and that's where her limited access allows her to get out in and around there. So I just want to take you through a few issues and questions that I particularly have. You talked earlier on about the transition for people with disabilities from the congregated settings, and you clearly confirmed today that the targets are not being reached, the timelines are not being reached. And that's extremely disappointing, because this is a particular group of people that have historically had other issues and difficulties. And in this, decongregated settings and getting people out of institutional care and getting them back into the community, this was flagged as being a really progressive bit of work. And yet, I would live near one of these institutions that was closed down, but people didn't have happy experiences many times. They were forced out. It wasn't altogether about making facilities better for you. They were taken many miles away from where they had lived for 10 years, where they had built friendships and relationships. So I think I'd like to know why, in your experience, what is the problem? Because clearly this is a very important issue. These are people who are living in congregated settings. Government policy is to close these places down and get people out. And I always argue there will be some people that would wish and want to stay in more formal residential settings. And it's all about choice, and it has to be all about rights and choices. And I've met people who are being forced out of sort of community settings into independent living, but they weren't given the support, so they didn't want that. So we have to respect all aspects of it, because I think that it's about the person. It's about empowering the person to make decisions about where they want to live. So you might just share with us on that. And is there some process of reviewing that? And what's your experience in terms of government departments and the relevant agencies in relation to this thing about people coming from congregated settings back out into the community? I'd like to really hear some more about why is it not happening as fast as it's meant to be happening? What are the pitfalls? What are the problems? How do you see it being overcome? And what's the review mechanism, if there even is a review mechanism? And then just to move on, there's talk about this. Can you share with us your experience in relation to the local authorities in addressing public housing need for people with disabilities? Because again, my experience in some local authorities is good, is progressive. In others, they're being told, look, we don't have the facilities. And you mentioned, or one of you mentioned in your submission about the Part 5s, and particularly when they're in small one-offs, these small developments, that local authorities are sometimes offsetting them with taking the money or taking other issues there. And these strike me as ideal situations where you can have these, because it's also important, and I think, again, you made this very well in your submission, we don't want disability zones. We want people living meaningfully right across the community. And so it strikes me that there are opportunities for one-off units, particularly in the private sector. But we want to talk not only about the public housing, we also need to ensure that your target of 7% happens in the private sector. And there are elderly people as well who have different degrees of a disability. So you might just talk us through that. And then because I think this Part 5 obligation issue is very contentious in some local authorities and they're not delivering. You might tell us that. And then just one other point, the RIAI, which you haven't seen, but they sent in a submission to us, a brief one. It was very much a Q&A, and I'm sure the committee will be happy at some point to circulate it to you. But they talk about they compare us with other European countries, and they say, we understand that Ireland has no mandatory standards for either accessible or adaptable housing, and this is badly needed. And I would agree. And I'd like you to talk us through how you're advocating for that, because if we to have any meaning in this committee and take your work further, clearly we need mandatory standards in legislation. And finally, I want to just draw attention to Fingal. Fingal County Council have done an excellent 10 ways to construct a more lifetime adaptable and aged family home. And it's a really, really positive thing. And I think sometimes it's about very simple messaging. And I would appeal to you not only to engage with the local authorities, but to engage with the elected members of those local authorities, because I think you will find in them advocates who will advocate for the objectives that we all want. And sometimes we tend to rely on the executive, the architects, the housing officials, be they in the local authorities or in the departments. And I'm going to suggest to you that you will be much more effective, as well as keeping them on board, but advocating and having similar engagement as you're having with us here, but having that engagement with local authorities, because I think it would be fruitful and it would be, I think you'll get good results. So well done again, very detailed submissions, and you might just address those 2 or 3 queries that I raised with you.
Start with Siobhan, yeah, and then I got it.
Thank you very much for acknowledging our input and also for your questions. On the issue of decongregation, it is established government policy to move away from institutional care, and the National Disability Authority would over many of years have undertaken research, looked at the experience in other countries, also looked at the whole issue of the quality of life that can be achieved through that. We've come across cases where it was believed it would not be possible, it wouldn't work out, where people were reluctant to move, and when it was being done effectively and they've been well supported, it has really had immense and incredible benefits for them and immensely improved their quality of life. Obviously, there's the whole importance of effective transitions and how people are supported through all that process. It's quite a complex issue to be decongregating, but also to line up the right kind of package of supports in the community. You're talking about moving away from traditional services and a culture of care in segregated service provision. So moving from that into an independent living arrangement in a community is quite a big move. So there's a lot of work to be done with the staff, with the services, with the community to make that work. And through that process, and we had somebody over from another European country who talked about needing a year lead-in for any individual for it to work effectively in order to accustom them to the idea, to support them through it, to work through them on the options, who they want to live with, where they want to live, and then how that transpires and is put in place. We know that sometimes there is inconsistency in terms of lining up care packages with finding accommodation, and obviously within the housing crisis, finding accommodation but then finding the right kind of accessible accommodation is proving difficult. So what happens in terms of other policy areas to progress universal design, for example, can help alleviate some of those pressures here. So there are many actors that have a role to play in making decongregation work. We are undertaking at the moment an evaluation project looking at the situation for 600 persons with disabilities. About a quarter of those would be people who are moving from institutions to the community. We are interviewing them before they move and after they move to the community sometime later to understand the impact it has had on their lives, their experience and how it is operating. We're also looking at the costs of those new models of support. But the big challenge is to have adequate investment to fund the kind of support packages that are needed and funding to support that transition and also then to ensure access to mainstream services within the community. So say that there are a lot of issues at stake to make decongregation effective. We would be familiar as well with the research for the ESRI, but also research that indicates that more people with disabilities are living with deprivation. They're living in very poor accommodation. They're probably living in some of the more deprived areas as well. And this comes back to affordability of accommodation. So there is even more need to focus on access to housing for persons with disabilities. We have been engaging with a lot of local authorities. I take your point in terms of broadening that engagement. We've had some good experience. We're very familiar with the Fingal 10 points. We work closely with them on that, and we welcome the initiative by them to progress that. We have seen other positive initiatives by other local authorities, for example in Wexford, where they have set a target for 20% of all housing developments of over 5 houses to have a universal design approach with a focus on access to housing for persons with disabilities. We need more consistency with that. There are very developed guidelines. We've developed technical guidelines, the universal design, which look at 3 levels of housing. So there are the kind of information and guidance there to support some kind of development of standards and templates for housing for the future. I hope I did cover your queries there.
Siobhan, Tony.
I'll start with the congregated settings element of it, which isn't an area that we work directly with. The people or the members of our Wheelchair Association, when we talk about housing, are community-based. So you have two separate dealings there, if you like. So we're talking about people who could possibly be living with their parents, with their siblings, that never had the opportunity to have a home of their own due to lack of finances to purchase, to build, lack of social housing and lack of available housing to rent, or the rents are too high. We're also talking about people who are inappropriately placed in nursing homes, for instance, in hospitals, people who are homeless, who are wheelchair users, or people who have a disability. So you have 2 very different groups there, but I think what's common to everybody is humanity and our right to have a home of our own wherever we are. I think we all get institutionalised one way or other, whether that's in a big institution of 100 rooms or whether it's our family home with the people around us. You get used to that. As a government, I think as a country, we have an obligation to lead and to encourage people to flourish, you know, to become independent and to experience that which they don't necessarily know. You know, that a lot of people, a lot of us can be sheltered within our own workspace, within our own living environment or social environment, and it's only when you get new experiences that you build confidence and you get out there. You know, if you asked me 20 years ago, would I be sitting in Leinster House, you know, talking at a committee here, how does it not on your nanny? And yet here we are. Experiences grow. We as a government have to encourage that, and we have to give people the opportunities to do that. And that's back to IWA's vision of Ireland being a country that would lead in terms of its inclusivity. And we're not doing that. We should be ashamed, really, in terms of housing for people with disabilities. In terms of Part M, just to address that one briefly, recent conversation as an example with a local authority whereby an approved housing body would have approached them to say that they want to buy an existing housing estate that's developed or being developed or halfway there or whatever, and there's no wheelchair accessible housing whatsoever in that. My conversation was around, is there a Part 8 opportunity for Irish Wheelchair Association to get in early at the design stage where we could acquire through CAS funding some units for wheelchair users? Too late. They're designed, the plan permission is given, and they're on their way before they come to the approved housing body, before they come to the local authority to actually buy them. Of course, the local authority will give the go-ahead with the support of the department, because you could have 100 3-bed semi-detached 2-storey houses that will home people. So you have no sustainable community in terms of people with disabilities or older people. They're excluded from those. Anecdotally, a lot of local authorities would have accepted the funding from the Part 5 obligation or a one-off house in another location. And for obvious reasons in some cases, as I'm told, where, for instance, it could be 2 or 3 years before the development comes to its end. Whereas we have an immediate housing need now, and the developer offers 1 or 2 units in another location or in an apartment block, and they seize the opportunity to give someone housing immediately. So it comes back, in my view and the view of Irish Wheelchair Association, again, to the strategic planning at the early stages of inclusive communities, all around Ireland where state funding has been used to provide housing, that at that point we invest in sustainable housing developments and of mixed tenure. It's all there in policy. It's all there in paper. I was thinking actually in preparing for today, if I could have built a few houses with all the documents I was looking at, we'd be well on the way. Yeah, but so the intent is there, the policies are there, all that is put forward. What's not actually happening is at that early stage of design, ensuring we put forward that 7%, and that was after a discussion with various disability organisations, that 7% of every development. Now, bearing in mind that they're not, I may be going off the point a bit, they're not wheelchair exclusive housing. We're talking about the structural design with the future capability of having the space for wheelchair users within that. But Part 5 opportunities, I'm sure some of them are availed of. There's a lot of them being lost in that sense. If I shift slightly to the PA services, in IWA's pre-budget submission, which I'm sure many of you would have received, we would have put in a call for increased PA services nationally for people with disabilities of an extra 500,000 hours per year to touch the need that's not been met out there. But there is definitely a clear link between the two. But, again, in theory, it all stands up. You need the house, you need the PAs to move in. But, there's no housing. It's not there. It's not been designed. It's not been built. There doesn't seem to be any strategic planning around it. But the goodwill is there. But the offers aren't coming out. So we need both. We need the PA hours. And incidentally, all these are about contributing to the economy. If people get out, people get their independence. That people can work. PAs, they're employees as well. This is all generating income and inclusive societies.
Thank you, Tony. And now take them in groups of two, so I'll take Jennifer and then Owen.
Well, first of all, thanks, Cathaoirleach. I want to thank you all for coming in today, and I think all of us here realise how important this particular issue is to do with housing, and it's crucial. I myself would have sat on the Irish Wheelchair in Carlow on the board for, I'd say, at least 8 or 9 years. To this day, I still attend the AGMs and I work with them. And at every AGM, the first thing would come up would be lack of housing, footpaths, entrance into buildings, and just awareness. And I think today we need to go forward, because it's like, as some of the centre users would say, it's not until you're in a position that you're using a wheelchair, or if you have a buggy or whatever, that you realise how bad it is to go down a walk, if you're going to a town, is shopping, using footpaths. And again, it's life, isn't it? It's not until your own family is hit by, whether it's through someone with a disability or an elderly person. So it's crucial that awareness of what is happening is so important. Well, to do with the housing, I have constantly said that we need to talk about what is being built in Ireland and address the issues, because we really do only seem to be building one type of housing. That's actually very worrying, because we have a lot of people that are living older and we have more people with disabilities. I do notice that quite a lot of houses being built seem very tight, especially for wheelchair. If you notice a lot of the houses being built, I would see even recently with older people or people with disabilities, maybe some people I would have dealt with maybe got MS later in life or something like that. And the houses that they're actually living in are not actually, they're not able to take a wheelchair. And this is long term. This isn't in a house that would have been built maybe privately or local authority. But actually, if they ever have to use a wheelchair, it's an issue that we need to look at long term. That we build a house, whether it's a 2-storey or whatever, that is fit on the lower floor for wheelchair accessibility. A lot of them are not. I also have a concern that, dealing with local authorities, that children with disabilities are not actually giving a preference, and they're actually not. And it's worrying that you might have a child there and families are coming to you, and it's something that we actually really need to make sure that that does happen. And it's a priority for me anyway. I just want to know that, and I just want to, first of all, I want to say to my colleague Senator John Dolan, who has gone around to all the local authorities, and and I have to give you a compliment on the work that he's done on this, and even in the figures for my own area, Carlow, we have a population of 56,932, and out of that there's 8,237 of those living in Carlow with at least one disability. That's 14%. And that is why, Carlow, we need to make sure that we improve on this for people, and they're not. And there definitely is an issue with housing. We have such, over 8,000 people with disabilities. That's so unfair. And I find, for my own way that I would be working, even when you are representing people with disabilities or wheelchair they're not as made as a priority as there should, and we need to look at that, and we need to maybe even look at legislating, or maybe we need to make sure that there is a priority given to every local authority, that a wheelchair user or anyone with a disability has a priority on it, and then of course we need to look at building them. And again, I just want to say that building them is a massive issue. Like when you look at 17% of people with the disability are in social housing, compared with 11% in general population. So you have 17% of people with a disability in Carlow living in a social housing, compared with 11% of general population. That really worries me. And also, people with disabilities are more than twice as likely to report discrimination in relation to housing. And that, again, as we've said, is over 1.6 times more likely to live in poor conditions. These are important considerations when we look at providing good homes for good people. Can I just ask one question here, and it worries me, and this is to the NDA. What do you feel are the most important housing issues now that need to be addressed short term? And I just also want to speak about grants. That's huge. Disability grants, and particularly now, there should be some sort of a scheme where that most houses now have a wet room, because what's happening is, I'm finding now with grants, whether it's people with disabilities or elderly people, it's actually you're fighting constantly to get grants, and a wet room in particular is so important. And you could be waiting for months and months. You're even lucky if it's only months and months. So I feel going forward that people with a disability need to be prioritised, to have all these. Like, these are simple things in life. But again, as you spoke, it's about quality of life. And you know, I feel families really over the years have got so disheartened because we're not building them, we're finding it hard to get the grant money for them, and I just feel they're being forgotten. And again, I want just to say about the awareness, and maybe if you could come back to me to know what could the NDA do short term to make sure that we prioritise people with disabilities and give them a better access of life. But the biggest question I want to ask you all is, do you think it would be beneficial to have a person with a disability on the boards of every affordable housing agency and every planning department of our local authorities? And I think that's where we're falling. I think everybody there should be one person on every board to do with housing with a disability, because again, what I said, unless someone is in that position, they really don't know. And I think unless we actually have someone from all the different agencies on all these boards, I think we are not going to get the proper mix here. Thank you.
Owen.
And thanks to both organisations for their submissions. I also want to acknowledge we got some other written submissions, including from Independent Living Movement Ireland, which I think would be very useful for us. I also want to acknowledge two people. I know Joan Carthy is there, just to acknowledge on the record, Joan has been incredibly effective in lobbying members of this committee, myself included, just to ensure that in our own thinking about what we're doing here, the issues that we're now discussing formally are on our radar. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. And also again to echo Senator Boyhan's comments in relation to Senator John Dolan, who not just individually but also to the work that he's done on his informal committee, again has ensured that parties and some of us who may not have otherwise put this as central to the work we're doing do so. So I want to genuinely acknowledge that. There's a word nobody's mentioned yet, which is discrimination. And I think it's really important that we name this. People don't have to deliberately go out of their way to discriminate to allow a system to be in place that discriminates. And what we have in our housing system, and people with disabilities are one of 2 or 3 groups who have always been disadvantaged in our housing system. And it is a form of institutional discrimination. And I think from our committee's point of view, we have to understand that's the problem we have to get over. So this isn't just about a little bit of extra money there or a little bit of rule change here. It's about saying there are a series of institutional barriers that have been in place for decades that unless we remove them in policy and legislation and funding, we're going to be stuck in this problem. And again, that is not to accuse any official or any minister of intentionally going out of their way, but by virtue of the fact that they allow those barriers to remain in place, those discriminations and the hugely negative impacts they have on people's lives are perpetuated. This committee looks at 2 things, housing and planning, and I'm going to come back to that in a second, but what we're doing with these 2 hearings isn't just having a nice conversation. Our intention as a committee is then to produce a report with clear recommendations to go to the Minister. And that's why I think it's really important, particularly in the answers to the questions, we focus in on what are the real key priorities that we push the Minister on, because we can do a report and we can have a shopping list of 100 requests, and the longer your list of requests, the less likely the Minister and the Department are to respond. But if we really sharply focus on the key things that, if they were done, would make a substantial difference, I think our report could have an impact. I also want to say, like, we're all constituency politicians, and it's not just about people with disabilities or wheelchair users' access to housing. For example, in homelessness, along with travellers, people with disabilities and wheelchair users are the people who spend longest in emergency accommodation. In terms of getting out of inappropriate private rental accommodation or getting into the private sector, just like travellers, for different reasons, wheelchair users and people with disabilities are more disadvantaged. And I think that's really important just in terms of how we think about the recommendations. The very fact that some of the recommendations, for example, from the Irish Wheelchair Association are so basic, but you still have to come and ask for them, is just astonishing. The idea that we wouldn't have in our housing needs assessment forms a box that you tick to say that you're in need of accommodation suitable to live with a wheelchair is just, like, that's 1960s stuff, right? Likewise, the idea that local authorities in their housing delivery plans don't have to assess the level of need for people with disabilities and wheelchairs in their administrative area and work that into their 5-year plans. It beggars belief that your demands are actually so minimal, and I don't mean that in any way to disparage what you're asking for, but I would like to think that the 5 demands that are in the Irish Wheelchairs Association form the absolute minimum of what we ask for in our own report. And while I absolutely support the 7%, I suppose I want to give one caveat, which is it takes about 6 years to get a transfer from one local authority property to another in my local authority area, Centrum County Council. So in some senses, the 7% should be an absolute minimum because, of course, as the speakers know far better than members of the committee, the life cycle changes. And fine, you might not need to be in one of those 7% of the houses for the first 10 or 20 or 30 years of your local authority tenancy. But when something changes, you then have to go on a transfer list. And okay, some local authorities have a medical priority transfer list. It might take 3 years instead of 6 years on the regular list again, which is the waiting time of my own local authority. So in some senses, actually, what we really need to move to is exactly what the association are saying, is universal design, where the core structure of all new houses are at a future date easily adaptable, because that just makes sense. And it cannot cost, in terms of the structural basis of the house, it cannot cost any more in real terms for a house to have those key adaptable features in it. Obviously, when you then have to retrofit the house to meet very specific needs, that has an additional cost. But so I suppose the reason I'm saying that is just, well, I think the 7% is a good target. Universal design, and universal design not at the minimal end that the department often talks about, but moving up to the maximal end, I think again is what the committee should be working in support of. County development plans are all up for review. They will all start the reviews in September. And in some senses, the county development plans for me are absolutely key to meeting the demands that you're requesting here, because if local authorities, through their county development plans, make some of the things you're asking for mandatory from a planning point of view in both the public and private sector housing stock, that means nobody can get out of it. It just becomes the norm. And while we're having conversations in the Climate Committee about how to improve the energy efficiency standards through building regulations and planning requirements, I do think, and I'd like to hear your views on this, how we could, in our recommendations to the Minister and report, best argue for the reviews of the county and city development plans to incorporate some of this stuff, so it just becomes required. And that goes back to a point that Jennifer made. It's not just the design of the house. The local authority is also responsible for all other aspects of the planning in terms of the footpaths and the roads and the zebra crossings. And have you recommendations in terms of those types of things that would be very specific and very tight? The last kind of area of question is obviously we have a lot of old stock, and the adaptation grants are a perpetual source of dissatisfaction for people because, first of all, the application process is very onerous, whether you're a local authority tenant or private homeowner. But also, even when you get approved for the grant, the length of time you wait for the application, again, I can only speak for my own local authority, can be up to 3 years. So you can have somebody who, through age or change in circumstance in their life, can no longer use the upstairs of their home. They spend 9 to 12 months going through the application and approval process. They're then approved, it can take 2 to 3 years in South Dublin County Council for them then to get the funding released, unless they're in the most acute set of circumstances. And I'd like to hear your thoughts just in terms of how that plays out in other local authorities and what recommendations you have for it. I would be interested to know, just from the Disability Authority, are you proactively supporting and pushing with government centrally and locally the recommendations that are in the Wheelchair Association's report? Because they seem to me eminently sensible, and I know they're not the only things that are required. But and then from both presenters, if we were to have 3 key demands or 4 key demands in our report, I know the Wheelchair Association has 5, but the key things we need to push with the Minister, what would you recommend? Sorry, Pat.
You're all right. Start with yourself, Siobhan, again.
Thank you very much for that. I might start with the key demands, because I think it covers a lot of the points raised. I suppose some of the issues we see relate to the housing planning. For example, a decision on the size of apartments, which are very, very small, and we'll question whether they would be habitable by many persons with disabilities, and realising the different needs, particularly by persons with wheelchairs, but also the wider needs of others. So we would always have advised that it should be a universal design approach to that. We have submitted guidance on how to approach that, and we would feel if that could be addressed in the future, as many large developments are being planned and invested in, that would make a significant difference. But also the approaches, we gave the example of one particular local authority by setting a target for the number of universal design homes. As you say, they can be designed in such a way that they can be more easily adapted over time and very cost effectively. What we are hearing back, at least from one local authority area, is that by effective design of your standard 3-bedroom house, the 100 square metres, that you can get a really accessible home. So it's not a huge amount of extra cost. We're also hearing anecdotally that the costs of developing a universal design home are about 4,500 more than the cost of an average home as well. Now, we are going to do a cost-benefit analysis exercise ourselves, but anecdotally, that's the kind of information we're hearing. The long-term savings that can be derived from that, in terms of avoiding expensive alternative relocating, alternative types of residential care, for example, and also, as you said, the retrofitting in the future would certainly pay off very easily, that increase in costs. As we said, the revision of the Part M, we feel that is urgently required and could give the basis for making a lot of this mandatory. There is potential to look at ways of incentivising the market, particularly developers. Perhaps there could be something around VAT or whatever to encourage more universal design developments. As pointed out earlier, sometimes these plans are coming forward and they're already so advanced it's difficult to roll back. We think there's a lot that could be addressed by way of disability impact assessment of rules and regulations and policies and programmes. And for example, we hear cases of where people have gone for affordable housing. They've taken out the loan supported by the local authority. They finally acquire a disability, maybe later in life, and if they want to move to alternative accommodation, the clawback issue prevents them from moving. So looking at the rules, if you were disability proofing and realising that in the black and white, they are, as you say, causing a discriminatory effect for some people. I think in terms of promoting universal design and the enforcement of a universal design approach, it is about the sustainability of communities. That people are living within a community, that they're not living in an area of a community where there are a group of homes together for persons with disabilities or a group of homes for older persons. That a universal design provides for that integrated approach. It allows people to stay in their homes for longer instead of going into nursing care, for example, for older persons. And there are interesting examples there. We operated a joint project with the Department of Housing and Planning and Local Government on a Smart Ageing Universal Design Challenge. The winning project for that looked at a 3-bedroomed house and how the older person could remain living in that, living close to their neighbours, close to their services, close to facilities, by converting the upstairs area to a separate apartment, that could accommodate somebody that needed housing, but also provided an opportunity for company, for a bit of security, for better use of the accommodation. And the winning solution went on to be progressed, but now the department is funding 5 further projects for that to happen. So there are lots of practical things it can do, but rather than them be projects, it's about maybe rolling that out into some kind of national programme. In terms of persons with disabilities and boards, there are good examples of that in the transport area. But also it's important that there are effective means of engaging with persons with disabilities in a design, in the planning, and you do have the Housing and Disability Steering Committees in each local authority, and it's about how they could be more effective in their engagement, but also in the action plans that they devise and the targets that they have in those plans as well. And again, also cross-agency working. So the national strategies are in place, but how to make that cross-departmental working happen. And in the past, you have had sectoral plans under each of the government departments to outline how they were going to progress issues for people with disabilities, to progress inclusion, to progress accessibility matters and other issues. And within those plans, they were obliged to outline how they would support a work collaboratively with other government departments and agencies in relation to particular issues, and to set that out in the plan. So there are many ways that could progress accessibility of housing in that way. Thank you.
Tony?
Okay, thanks. I'd come back to Jennifer's comment there, if I may. You raised, I think, what's a very important one, or certainly a gateway to one. You referred to the children, and all the children that are out there with disabilities around the country. And they will have a need moving into the future. Historically, Irish Wheelchair Association was very aware that there was a huge underrepresentation of people with disabilities and with physical disabilities on the approved housing list. And I think it was in 2011 we had a national campaign and worked with local authorities on that, encouraging people to think ahead and to register their housing need with the local authorities. And at that point, following that campaign, there was over a 200% increase in the number of people who registered their need with the local authority. We still feel, given the adults that are out there, that there's still a huge underrepresentation on the approved housing lists, not to mention the children who cannot apply at this point in time, but in future will have a housing need. And I think that has to be considered in terms of our bigger vision for sustainable communities. I think very much at the moment we're on a reactive basis, going on the approved housing lists as they are, going by the allocations, who's next on the list, how long are you on it, and meeting it from that perspective. So if you couple that with what I was saying earlier about the housing development of 3-bed, semi-detached, 2-storey houses with no wheelchair accessible house included in that, and map that around the country, we won't have sustainable communities. We'll have exclusive communities and more of them. And that's not a society I think we want. So we have to consider children and adults an unmet need in doing that. And I would suggest that we step out of the immediate need and look sustainably into the next number of decades to see where do we want to go. And I repeat what I said earlier, we're not talking about exclusive wheelchair accessible houses. You mentioned earlier about building them. What's the need in them build? I would say before build, there's design. That's the key of what we're talking about here. We've heard a lot about universal design, Irish Wheelchair Association standards, the OT standards. It's all about the person and having that different levels of need. But for full-time wheelchair users is where I'm coming from, is that needs to be planned ahead. Is it beneficial to have someone with a disability on the boards? It's a bit like talking about your neighbour when they're not there. It's easy. When they're in front of you, you're more considered, I would suggest.
Yeah.
And I think, of course, it's a very simple, going back to Owen's observation earlier, of a simple thing that somebody with a disability being on any committee or any board is always a good thing, yes, into the future. So absolutely, I would agree with that. If I may use the opportunity for those who haven't been there already, I would extend an invitation to members of the committee who haven't had the experience of the living accommodation of people who are full-time wheelchair users in inappropriate accommodation. We'd be happy to coordinate visits to inappropriate and to best practice housing developments, because I think we can talk till the cows come home. And it's when you get the experience of people and how they're living that can really impact. So I extend that invitation, and I leave it with the Chair to come back if there's an interest, and we'd be happy to facilitate that. I know your question, Owen, was directed at NDA, but just to respond a little bit from my experience even of working with the Housing and Disability Steering Groups. Honestly, the intent is there. There's good intent, I think. There's a good intention. I wonder very often, are some of them a complete waste of time? I'm being quite honest. In terms of outcomes, you know, you have travel expenses and you have travel time and you have people coming from all over the place. But what are the outcomes in a lot of cases? I do question. There's great outcomes in some areas, and in others it's questionable. From my experience, people do what they're required to do. And I will bring that back to the Minister and to the Department. That's what people will target. I'm not so sure in terms of going straight to the county development plans and reviewing those. I think what will go into those is what has to go into those from a policy level, higher than the local authorities, and back to the Department. And I finished by bringing you back to our recommendations around 7% and a housing specification design. Just an interesting practical one. We built 7 under CAS funding. We had a site in Belmullet in Mayo. We built 7 wheelchair accessible houses down there, and we opened them in 2017. And they're fabulous houses. They've afforded great independence to the tenants who are in those. Some who have actually started working since they moved into the house. And it would do your heart good to even hear the transformation in their lives. But one of the things that was a battle going along was the size and the extra cost of doing all of this. I found on one of my visits with a tenant when I was there, I was in the bedroom, the main bedroom of the house, and it has a second small bedroom. They were reduced from the original size because they were too expensive, and there were an extra cost to the Exchequer. And what they effectively may have said to some people is that you will remain single. You certainly won't get a double bed, and you certainly won't go around both sides of the bed, or others won't, you know. And it was about extras, not about living, not about independence and all of that. So you have good practice and bad practice in all of that. It has to come from agree a spec for the different type of housing, 1 bed, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, whatever, and accept the fact that it's a requirement for this space, not extra space, design them to meet the needs of the person, and to accept that they cost more than standard housing. And that has to be at ministerial and department level, I would suggest.
Okay, thanks, Tony. Senator John Dowling, can I extend a warm welcome to you to the committee this morning, and also recognise the work you have done in this sector.
I'm being embarrassed this morning. Could I say, I'm delighted to be here and welcome the witnesses, and equally welcome the contributions made by my 3 Oireachtas colleagues. I'm in and out of different committees on a regular basis, but every one of them not just brought an interest, but a knowledge and an expertise and a commitment to the issue. So not everyone in the Oireachtas who's on different committees will have a depth of information and expertise about a particular issue. I totally understand that. But we had sort of 3 master classes from Oireachtas colleagues this morning. And the synergy between what's coming from the witnesses and what you've had here was something that is rarely seen. So I'd like to underline that. And I do understand that other members don't have the in-depth stuff. It's not a veiled criticism of other colleagues. But I think that this was a rare moment, and I'm hoping we'll have more of them in different committees. This is my 3rd committee being at this week. It was Foreign Affairs on Tuesday, Health yesterday. And I think it's the first time I went to 3 committees in the 1 week as well. But the IWA's pre-budget submission are 3 recommendations for budget 2020. And it's interesting, the housing is in the middle. Assisted living is to one side of it, and transport. And it's a picture of people need support. It's the interlocking pieces. People need supports to be able to effectively live in the community. You live in a house to be part of a community, and some people will need the assisted living supports for that. They need adaptations and accommodations in their accommodation. And it's all about not spending 24 hours of 7 days in that house. As I often say, it's about being out and about. I want to particularly, I've had an involvement with both organisations on the board of the NDA for a number of years from when it kicked off, and as an employee for 20 years from 1980 to 2000 with the IWA. And I want to just for a minute go, an IWA is a magnificent track record in this stuff. In the early 70s, it was clocking on about the building regulations in relation to housing, footpaths, the whole range of stuff. We didn't get the Part M, I think it was 1990 or into the 90s, when it was legislated for. The issue of mobility allowance, another thing that IWA kicked into space. In the mid-60s, a man long deceased now, Liam Maguire, an absolute champion of the whole driving and accommodation thing, and the benefits that are there now go down to work he did in the 60s, and he kicked off the whole movement about making air travel accessible. They're part of the legacy of that organisation, and we will think about it as an organisation in other spaces as being a big service provider. But it has had a marvellous track record over 15 more years in relation to practical advocacy for people to be out and about. And this is a lovely opportunity for me to put that on the record. The issue of, I was delighted to hear, okay, you have another suite of hearings coming up, and you're going to have a report. One thing that struck me that I thought actually in many ways that Owen also almost did a first draft of the foreword or the introduction to it, and lots of the things that were mentioned are important to that. I've seen in the Transport Committee last year an issue that clicks in very nicely with this whole area, where they did a report that people with disabilities organisations and whatever in, and they're asking the Minister, one of their recommendations was that the Minister would come in every 6 months and respond to the list of recommendations that are made to keep the thing alive and give it traction. So I would just mention that as one important thing. A couple of other things that strikes me about what might go into that report and has been mentioned today. The demographics. It's been mentioned by the NDA, 20% increase in people with disabilities within the next 7 years. Like, we better wake up. That the numbers of people in local authority accommodation as a percentage of the population is 50% higher for people with disabilities than it is for the rest of the population, the deprivation. I think those things need to be set out in it. The active involvement of other departments, and I did a piece of work last year with education, 3 departments, education, health and social protection and employment affairs, where they looked at the interconnectedness of issues around activation into employment and that. And I suppose a very particular question would be to name, there's 15 or 16 departments, so please don't name them all. But would you name 2 others or max 3 others that actually are needed to pull together to try and move this on in a more effective way? The demographics, I think, in relation to this issue and broader in relation to disability and the interconnectedness between that and value for money and investment, and thinking about investment in services as distinct from which the micro cost of given it another square foot of space or whatever. The Rebuilding Ireland, July 2016, yeah, I knew the expert over here. And, I can't remember the page now, but about halfway through it or whatever, there's a section on disability. And my analysis of it, it was, and I think Tony has, from IWA, has echoed this a bit, if I'm interpreting the comments he made towards the end there. Very strong on processes. We've this committee, we've that committee, and this one feeds into that one. And all I could see was officials putting documents in a wheelbarrow and taking them over to here to this committee and then going off to another one, subsets of that. And very weak on what it was actually going to do. And I think that the evidence today shown that an awful lot hasn't happened in the last 3 years for people with disabilities. And what amazed me was it didn't even have the statistic that I think has been referred to here without naming the number. I think there was 3,919 people with disabilities from the 2013 survey that the local authorities do. They didn't even mention there were people who were seeking housing. And that to me said, do you know what? We're going to solve the macro problem of housing and homelessness, whatever, for people in Ireland, and avoid dealing with people that we know for generations and decades have had issues with housing. So I'd be interested in any comment people have that. The other question I'd like to ask is are we actually making progress? Right? If somebody is earning the same amount of euros today as they earned 5 years ago, you can't say to them credibly that their income hasn't dropped, because the cost of living, even if we didn't put housing into it, has gone up. So we will have press releases about we're putting more money in and it's increased at 10% or 15% on last year for this, that, and the other. But actually, what's your assessment of, are we actually draining the swamp, or are we falling back, even if there's some more funding going into it? I'm thinking about the demographics, the unmet need, and whatever. The waiting list, coming to a conclusion, yeah, the waiting list for grants, etc. I want people just to think, thank you, Chair, take a child, and marvellous things have happened in the last 10, 20 years in terms of kids being able to go to regular schools and be educated with their brothers and sisters. But it strikes me, and you think about the adoption grants, most of those are coming from families where they're trying to kick off family formation, pay high mortgages, rents, whatever. And they're living, of course, in houses that are not adapted and really don't have much capacity to be easily adapted. That's the fact of life. But now you're going to have a child living in that house. And we can't even, as I see it, easily make that house adaptable. They'll go onto waiting lists, the income criteria and all the rest of it virtually make it impossible for that family to have a house that their child can actually operate in and live in, and couldn't have. So that just strikes me. That's a vignette. Finally, decongregation. There are another 1,300 plus people, young people under 65, who are in nursing homes. And it has been accepted that's by the HSE that some of those shouldn't be there. I would think none of them should be there, because nursing homes are designed for people who, on average, are 80 years plus, and they live 2 years of their life there. And you could have someone, even if it's 60, 50, 40, 30, going into those. And like, what's actually been done to make sure to maximise independent living and whatever. I'll leave it at that, and I thank the committee extremely for their work on this.
Siobhan, start with yourself again.
My apologies, because I thought there was a question earlier about the grant scheme and the waiting list and that. I meant to come back on that point. Starting with the grant scheme itself, there clearly are issues with regard to the waiting list. And some of that is relating to, again, lining up across agencies between whether it's the lining up the OTs with the system and that. And also, sometimes it's about the understanding of disability and different types of disabilities and different needs. And we don't deal with information queries, but they sometimes come our way, and we're hearing cases where maybe a child has autism and the housing authorities are making a decision which doesn't necessarily understand the situation for the family or the child. So it's very black and white. Now, we did produce some guidelines on autism, but it goes beyond that to embed that in the system. And again, go back to looking at processes and decisions to support that. But the other issues in terms of the grant scheme can also be the level of the grant available. And going back to Senator Dolan's point about the cost of living now, the cost of making adaptations has increased, particularly if it comes to building extensions. And the alternative costs are, obviously significantly more, so it would make more sense to review the level of grant, but also the time frame involved, because costs are arising over the course of an extended time frame. Obviously, if they could apply a universal design approach to the standards that they apply, even for the works to be done with that grant, it would have longer term benefits as well. We would also suggest that where the local authority itself is having upgrading works done in different buildings and repairs, that they should always apply a standard of universal design in that, because it mightn't be an immediate need, but it will be maybe down the road in those properties. There's definitely a need to identify and agree an increase in the numbers of social housing and the numbers of access to social housing for persons with disabilities. In terms of how the national housing strategy is performing and what's happening on housing, and is it improving, there's certainly some good foundations being put in place there by way of very practical guidelines, by way of some of those structures. But it's the next level of that in terms of what they're implementing by way of actions and the targets that they're setting for that, and being accountable for delivery on. So we definitely would think that, particularly as the housing strategy is coming to an end next year, the mid-term review is underway, there is a real opportunity to look at that and look for something more concrete and ambitious. And it fits within the ambit of the strategies that are there, but something to deliver on the ground in that regard. You also asked the question about persons with disabilities in nursing homes. That should not be there, and we would be very aware of that, and that has to be factored in terms of, particularly in line with the UN Convention on Persons with Disabilities, but also in terms of their rights to be part of the community and live full lives. And Ireland will, within the next year, be due to report on how it's progressing actions in relation to the UN Convention. And Article 19 is very much about independent living. So these are the issues that the progress will have to be demonstrated on. So I think that was, in general, I answered the question.
Thanks, Tony.
Okay, and on the grant scheme, John, again, I have the other copy here, the pre-budget submission that Irish Wheelchair Association submitted for this year, and one of them relates directly to the Housing Adaptation Grant. I just noticed yesterday, again, in reading through the fourth report on the implementation of the National Housing Strategy for people with a disability, it quoted the expenditure on the grants, like for 60 million, which sounds huge. It actually averaged out at about 6,000 per person when you divide that out. A practical example of that is one of our own, where a tenant, her needs changed, profound physical disability, applied for the grant, needed an extra bedroom built onto a small one-bedroom house. So the cost at the end of the day, after tendering and going out for a number of prices, was 63,000 to complete the extension, which was a bedroom en suite and a bit of reconfiguration. The maximum grant was 30,000. So what happened, fortunately, in that case, that this person contributed the other 30 they luckily came along to them at that point in time. I think that's my understanding of it. Otherwise, it wouldn't go ahead, and that would be a typical example of the grant. It doesn't meet. It's a figure. It's something that somebody said somewhere and stood back from it. That doesn't deal with the reality of life and the reality of the economy and the increasing costs that we refer to again and again. So yes, it's wonderful for the small things, small adaptations in a house, but for more substantial ones, there needs to be a serious look at that, and on a case by case, the flexibility given to the local authorities to deal with that, because expenditure there is needed, and it makes savings. On the other hand, as a result of these adaptations, it actually cuts back on the requirement for personal assistance for the level of that, because if you have a house that meets your needs and you have a ceiling tracking hoist, for instance, as opposed to two PAs supporting you, two as opposed to one, it's a complex setup, but it's a figures game, and somebody just has turned the other way and is not looking at it as far as I can see. The expenditure, that 60 million on housing adaptation grant, how long are we going to continue that and not build houses that in the first place are wheelchair accessible out in the community, or that have high degree of universal design that can have simple adaptations over time? That if we look at sustainable communities, if we do some long-term planning and design these houses to a degree specification, you over time will be reducing the requirement for the housing adaptation grant that's out there. So that's on that point. I think you asked what departments John might come in there. Well, the obvious one is Department of Health. I think in terms of the funding of personal assistance and the protocols and all that, and there is work being done on that, but they're an obvious one. Who holds the purse strings? Public expenditure, and obviously everyone needs to talk and realise there's costs here, verified costs, and that it isn't a battle every time you go back to something. And Department of Transport, I think you referred to all these earlier. Obviously, again, communities that have transport, going back to our pre-budget submission, the PAs, the housing and the transport, they're obvious ones that, and I'm sure there are others as well that we can bring into the loop. The nursing homes, you referred there to 1,300 people inappropriately placed in nursing homes. I think I referred to that earlier in the conversation. I would be going back and I would be encouraging that the unmet need for housing is recorded, that we actually get a full picture. At the moment with local authorities, some of them are resisting a call from people to register their housing need to plan for the next 5 years or whatever, because they have such numbers as they are. They don't want it to grow, and government don't want to see the numbers grow, and they want to see them coming down. But there's a lot of need there, including people in nursing homes. You could multiply that many times by the number of people living on people's couches or living in family homes, be it siblings, elderly parents and all of that. So it's only a snapshot of a bigger number. One thing I would throw into all of that, and it's gone back to the housing design one again, there's room here for creativity in terms of the models of housing. So if you take a house, a two-bed house with one person living in it and their PA, and you take a nursing home which could have 50 or 100 bedrooms in it, there's so many models that can fit in the space between that, where, for instance, you could have two houses sharing a PA room. So they can share the one PA at night that they can call on, 3 houses sharing one PA room, 4 houses sharing a PA room. So instead of 4 separate PAs in 4 separate locations or a nursing home, that you have a facility that's designed and that's funded with assistive technology we didn't mention here today, that also would save in the long term, with a short-term outlay, would have long-term savings for the exchequer again. So there's a lot of creativity that can be brought into that loop to bring people out of nursing homes into setups that support them socially, emotionally, and physically within a nice environment, if you like.
Thanks, Chair. 2 questions. The first one about decongregation. The target was 219. The 219 target is not going to be met. What's your take on how that is likely to pan out now? Is it a very short delay, or is it going to be more significant, and the implications of that?
very much. I'm not sure I could be clear on when the decongregation will happen. Certainly there are a number of thousand people yet to be moved to the community, and that's, when they talk about decongregation, it's looking at residential centres of 10 persons or more. And so how long that would take. They definitely have invested in an accelerated programme for a number of sites, and there's a few hundred people left from those sites yet to be moved out. So, but that had a specific investment programme to support that. I might come back on the other question about the departments now that I didn't answer earlier as well, if that's okay. I suppose the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform would be a critical department. I mean, the focus in all government departments now is on financial sustainability. So again, universal design provides a financially sustainable approach to housing, and so how you look at that across the board. The whole area of housing in the community is about the development of the community as a whole. So the departments with responsibility for community development and investing in community development have a key role. I think the Department for Children and Youth Affairs and supporting families and what happens in the community and holding units together. There are many departments who, within their remit, living in the community and good living arrangements and all of that this is relevant to. And just so I would suspect that there are many departments and agencies that are involved to some degree, and disability is part of everybody's agenda, and living in the community, having access to a home, and what that means even in terms of getting access to employment, for example, having a fixed address, for example, they would all have relevant roles.
Tony, do you want to?
Just consulting with Joan here behind me. Department of Justice, maybe another one, discrimination, somewhere along the road. Congregated settings, I think I referenced this earlier, Mick, that it's not an area that we're overly involved in, but I do meet representatives at some of the disability steering groups, and I think again one of the issues is a common one, is the supply in a lot of cases of housing, because this is another important one. If I was to go back to our recommendations around do you require wheelchair accessible housing, I was at one recently, and the figures were presented in that county what the needs were under physical, sensory, intellectual and mental health, and we pointed out that physical was the biggest area of need. I pointed out that a lot of people with physical disability do not require wheelchair accessible housing, and a lot of, one of my colleagues pointed out that a lot of people with intellectual disability require wheelchair accessible housing. So there's a huge bit of analysis to be done there, and again back to our question, do you require wheelchair accessible housing? But it doesn't seem it is the reality. The housing is not designed, it's not built, and therefore it's not available in sustainable communities around the country, so that people can decongregate from settings or from the family home, the nursing home or the homeless couch.
Yeah, second question is in relation to mandatory standards. So if we were to take the European Union, for instance, would mandatory standards be the norm? Would it be a majority of EU states? And from the research that you've done, the difference in real terms, in terms of, facts, figures, but also in terms of people's lives, between a country where you have mandatory standards being implemented and what the position is here. If you could just give us a little bit of an insight into that.
Standards can often be voluntary, whereas the regulations would be mandatory. There are different approaches. Often you're looking at minimum standards or minimum degree of accessibility built into those regulations as well. So you can have standards that can push beyond the limits of regulation to a higher standard. In terms of universal design, I suppose we're not seeing that factored into many countries at a high level of accessibility. So we certainly have been progressing it in other areas, particularly in the design of goods and services and products. We've been working with EU standard bodies and the ISO as well on standards matters, but generally in terms of manufacturing and goods. And we're starting to see a kind of a buy-in to a universal design focus there. There was just a standard launched in the last couple of weeks, which was promoting and rewarding anyone who had signed up to a standard on universal design in how they produce goods and services as well. So we're starting to see an opening in there in terms of at international level of backing on universal design, which could be then helpful in terms of how that could be adopted at local level. Our role in our Centre for Excellence in Universal Design is to promote the adoption of standards, whether they're voluntary or not, by all the different bodies. And so we do proactively engage with that. We often develop a lot of very practical guidelines to support the implementation of those standards as well. We've worked with the tourism sector, for example. We've developed, obviously, a Building for Everyone suite of guidelines. We've built or designed the universal design homes. We've also done guidelines for homes for persons with dementia, so they could stay living in their own homes as well. But again, they would be voluntary.
Tony, do you want to?
Yes. First of all, I acknowledge the standards of the NDA and the different levels of those. I acknowledge the OT, Occupation Therapists standards or guidelines. And I present Irish Wheelchair Association best practice standards. And I would emphasise based on 60 years of experience. As Owen said, I'd like to think we're a very practical organisation that's based on the experience of people with disabilities. Anything in our standards are required to live independently, but they're only standards. And that's why our recommendation is that Part M, that only allows people to visit the house. It's visit but not live in. And in practice what that means is that it says you can get into the house, that you, where possible, these are all things you're endeavouring to do, you can get into the house, access to the downstairs living room and to this Part M toilet, which incidentally you may not fit into, depending on yourself and the size of the chair you have. But God forbid you'd want to stay or to live in it. It doesn't allow for that. The UK building regulations do have different levels of regulations there, including wheelchair accessible housing. But standards, as Siobhan said, standards are standards and they're not mandatory. And that's why we need an absolute overhaul of them. But do we have to wait for that, or do we get the department to fast track an agreed specification for wheelchair accessible housing, for instance? There's a lot there. The standards are there, the paperwork is there, the intent is there. It's the actual obligation to deliver on them. That's,
is UK the gold standard?
I don't know. I couldn't answer that now. I don't know.
I would defer to Dr. Craddock.
The UK has the BS 8300 would be the standard that's used in the UK, and as people have commented, they're voluntary, but that's used in the revised Part M 2018 in the UK, which Tony has referred to, where they look at 3 levels of housing within the revised Part M: standard, lifetime adaptable and wheelchair, which again would be very compatible to the 3 levels we have built into our universal design home guidelines. And actually our own guidelines would be above the UK standard and the new Part M in the UK. So there is a standard that has been developed, and we've looked at it. A lot of developers or agencies would actually use the BS 8300 as a reference, but the regulation, as learner colleagues have said here, is the mandatory part, which I think we've all commented on, needs to be updated and improved on the level that's there at the moment. As Tony's pointed out, it's just about visibility at the moment rather than actually living in the home.
Sorry, Mick, did you ask me, what was the gold standard, the EU or our one?
The UK had been instanced as a jurisdiction where the standards were higher than here, and I was wondering, is UK best practice, or would there be other EU countries that have gone further?
I thought you said the EU. Yeah, no, offered?
At the present moment in time, there's a new standard being developed, which we're heavily involved in, which I would say will be 2021, 22 before that will actually be agreed. And that's looking at buildings in general, not just at housing. And the National Standards Authority have a mirror committee which IWA sit on as part of, I suppose, the wider consultation with the key constituents in Ireland, looking at better accessible buildings, which would include housing as part of that. But that's a bit down the road on that European standard.
Okay, anybody else wants to come back in? Or maybe just make a few comments myself before we finish up. And I think Jennifer might have mentioned it, about having somebody with a disability on a board or on different organisations. Would it make a difference? I think it does make a difference, and I think I can give my own examples of it. We were lucky in Wicklow in 2014 to elect our first councillor with a disability, Miriam Murphy. You listen to Miriam anyway, that's for sure. Hashtag now Murphy in motion is her handle. Yeah. And then indeed my own mother and the experience she's gone through having to retrofit her own 1960s house. So a combination of partly living with him and working closely with somebody with disabilities makes your mind, changes your mindset and how you think. And there's no point denying that. It actually does. And Miriam had a huge role to play. She was on the board of Wicklow Tourism. So she brought that disability aspect to the whole tourism product in Wicklow, and in fairness that's feeding down now into our tourism plan that we consider people with disabilities. And my own mother, who would be very proud of the home she's lived in, now has to negotiate a wheelchair through narrow doors and the paint's coming off. And it's upsetting her, it's upsetting her, but she won't show it. And they're the practical things, and when you live through these, it does make a difference in how you think. I want to put that on the record first, because, when we don't live through these, we don't think of these on a daily basis, and it does make a difference. Just a few points in relation to, I equally have a hotel, so a relatively old hotel that was built in the 1820s, and I've built new extensions onto it. So I know the difference of trying to retrofit something and designing with disability in mind. Now, you could put in one disability toilet in the 1800s building, you could put in 10 for the same cost when you're designing with a new build in mind. So going back to, I think, Siobhan, you mentioned a figure of, I think it was about 4,500, was it, if you were to try and design in some key disability factors into a house that would make it more livable. I wonder, do we know what percentage of our housing stock has had to be adapted overall? So realistically, is this 4,500 figure an extra burden, or is it a saving long term in relation to our housing stock? Because there's no two ways about it. Designing and building it in mind makes it a lot easier and a lot cheaper, and I think delivers a better result at the end of the day. And the other point I just wanted to make, I think, Tony, you said we should be designing 7% of our stock of housing for people with disabilities. And I think, Siobhan, you mentioned that people on the lower income and on the social housing list is nearly 13% of people, and on the private sector is 8%. So the question is actually 7% too low, and should we be aiming actually at a higher percentage? Okay, all right.
Most people with disabilities.
Grand, okay. So there are just a few comments, and maybe if you want to come back on. Sorry.
Sorry, just because it's kind of pertinent. We had a session a couple of weeks back around retrofitting, and one of the things, if you remember, Pat, the Tipperary Energy Agency were saying is to simplify and improve access to retrofitting funds, to have what they call a blended model of grant aid and long-term low-interest government-backed loans. And I just think, given that we're talking about the same set of problems, which is, even though there are grants for private homeowners, they're difficult to access if you don't have the matching funds, or if it goes above. It might be worthwhile, in the context of the report, looking at making the same argument for a blended funding model to make it easier to access adaptation grants coupled with long-term low-interest loans where the household doesn't have the means, such as the individual you talked about who had the 30 grand. So just maybe that's something we can work in as a recommendation.
Does anybody, Tony or Siobhan, want to make any final comments? Or
Maybe just to come back on the costs for a university designed home. I said that's just anecdotal evidence so far, but we are going to do a cost benefit analysis, so we would hope to have further information within the next 12 months as such. Also, maybe to say that it's the sustainability as well is the added value, you know, of that housing. It's not even just the physical costs and the savings on retrofitting. It's the long term, and we're doing a lot of work with the agencies working on kind of, you know, the environment and sustainability energy of Ireland as well on these matters on university design to promote that. So we think that there's a lot that can be advanced through that and from that lens as well as much as accessibility.
Okay. Sorry, Tony. Sorry. Yeah,
no, I was just to thank the committee for the opportunity here, and I reiterate the invitation to visit people and get the first-hand experience.
Okay. John, do you want to?
Yeah. Just 3 quick points. Last hear what you said about the engagement of people with disabilities in different fora and committees and that. And you mentioned Councillor Miriam Murphy, and she came back with an enhanced vote. So that's good news. That is so important. And in relation to that, and this might be challenging for you, I saw it on the transport piece of work. When they wrote the report, they were able to pepper it with actual quotes and evidence from people with disabilities, the lived experience. And my request is for people, would it be possible to have a session someday, and I know all the logistics of setting up committees, to have some people with disabilities in here actually talking about and setting out what the impact, and maybe a parent of a child or something. I think if that was possible, it would really enrich the report, and it drives home the point that you have so well made. The final point is that, Siobhan from the NDA talked about we have to make our first report next year, be ready for our first report to the UN Disability Committee. The report you do here will be really very important, and it will show that this committee is taking seriously the UN CRPD and the articles that it has in relation to housing and community. Gormagat.
Can I thank the witness? Sorry, Siobhan. Sorry, you're all right. No problems.
It was on the point of retrofitting, and just some information we picked up from the UK. They have done a study of the housing stock that they have, and they found that 50% of the houses are not adaptable. And of the remaining 50%, about half of them would cost over 15,000 sterling to upgrade. So I just thought that was maybe something interesting to add.
Yeah, no,
thank you.
I appreciate both your engagements today, and it will feed into our report at the end of the day. And that report will complement our universal living report as well, which we did here last year. So would I finally like to thank all the witnesses for attending today and engaging with the committee. The meeting is now adjourned, and the next meeting of the Joint Committee will be held on Wednesday, the 10th of July at 9:30 a.m, nearly said p.m. there, when we will continue our consideration of housing of people with disabilities. Thank you all very much for your engagements. Thank you.